Okay, Tom, do you want me to explain about the assignments and the lab reports, like the grade change that we talked about?
Oh, yeah, yes, absolutely.
Okay. So on your old syllabus, I had that assignments were going to be a total of 50 points, and then there were going to be quizzes that were going to be 50 points. But Tom and I and Dixie have talked about it, and we decided that your lab reports are actually going to count for the 50 points instead of quizzes. Because we don't really think you'll need that many quizzes and assignments and that much going on. So if I do decide to give any quizzes, those will just go towards your assignment points. So that change has been reflected in the syllabus, but I just wanted to go ahead and let y'all know. And I'll probably put an announcement on Blackboard as well, just in case you forget. But so there will be no 50 points for quizzes. It'll just be 50 points for your lab reports and then 50 points for assignments. So good news, because there's not that many quizzes now. All right. Does anybody have any questions from like last week's material? Questions about lecture stuff in general before I get started?
Yeah. Do you like being called Kayla or Miss Brooks?
Actually, Miss Brooks or Leanne is fine.
Sorry.
I go by my middle name, so you can call me Leanne or Miss Brooks, whichever one I'm cool with.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? All right, then I'm going to go ahead and get started. Today we're going to go over Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 to kind of get caught up a little bit. But there's PowerPoints aren't too terribly long, so hopefully it won't be too bad.
You should be. The slides are on Blackboard?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, notes.
Okay. Can everybody see that okay? The slides on the screen?
Yeah.
Okay. So today we're going to cover Chapter 2, and we're going to talk about the origin and development of agriculture. So the objectives of this chapter are to give an introduction to the domestication of animals and plants and how that came about, where, when, and why plants were domesticated, changes in the productivity of cereal production, and then where, when, and why animals were domesticated, and domestication in reverse, that should have an E on it, in the case of feral animals. All right, so agriculture, well, before the development of agriculture, humans were kind of hunter-gatherers. So they would kind of wander around all over the land and gather grains from wild grasses, fruits, roots, and then they hunted large and small wild animals, and then they fished for food. So they really took advantage of the vast landscape in the area that they were in, and they moved around a whole lot. So they didn't really grow much right where they were. So during the Neolithic Revolution, and Neolithic means the New Stone Age, just in case you were wondering, there was actually a shift from this nomadic lifestyle and the hunting and gathering stage to planting and staying in one place. And this had many advantages that we're in a little bit later in the slides. So this shift from nomadic hunting to staying in one place actually allowed the population to grow. So because of this, they decided to stay in one place and start growing crops. It led to the development of permanent settlements. So there became a need to protect the land, the animals, and the stored grain that were there. And this led to the development of the first military, actually. And then there were costs associated with the soldiers used to protect those things, the equipment, and then, leaders are needed for all of that. And that led to taxation, which led to a need for a written language and number system that could be used for record keeping. As agriculture developed further with extra food that people had needed to store, they didn't always need to be actively working in agriculture, at least not everyone. So other people could adopt specialized jobs outside of agriculture. And therefore, due to the development of agriculture, society became more hierarchical with different kind of levels of jobs and things. So animal and plant domestication started in a location known as the Fertile Crescent. So this also happened during Neolithic times, that's kind of the period that we're going to be mainly talking about today. So this area you can see on this map, and I believe there's also a picture in your book. It's a little different from this picture. I thought this picture showed it a little bit better. So you can see this area all right here along the Euphrates River, the Tigris River, and then development along the Nile River came a little bit later as well, and some during that period. But so you can see lots of rivers, lots of water surrounding there. This land was really great for planting crops and things like that. So that's kind of where agriculture began to come about. So some domesticated plants and animals that were domesticated during this time were cereal grains, wheat and barley, pulses such as lentils, peas, chickpeas, and bitter vetch, flax, which could be used to make linen, cattle, sheep and goats, pigs, geese, and cats, and also dogs as well. So in addition to the Fertile Crescent, there were other areas of the world that had civilizations forming as well. So in East Asia, they were domesticating rice, pigs, chickens, ducks, and geese. And then in Meso and South America, they were domesticating potatoes, turkeys, alpacas, llamas, Muscovy ducks, and wild rice and guinea pigs. And so you can see these different civilizations. So up here in Mexico, you have the Aztec civilization, and then a little further down, you have the Maya civilization. And then here in South America, you have the Incas, kind of over there in the Peru area. And alpacas and llamas were still really big in that area. So the first plants to be domesticated were cereals. I know I kind of briefly mentioned cereals in the last lecture before this. So cereals such as wheat, rice, corn, and barley, those are kind of the main ones that were domesticated at first. Then pulses were domesticated, and pulses are edible seeds of the plants in the legume family. Because actually the term pulses was not super familiar to me, so that's what they are. And then that included lentils, peas, chickpeas, and bitter vetch. So other plants that were domesticated, we have soybeans, which are right here, and those were domesticated in northeast China, over the peninsula. Potatoes in South America and the Andes region, and then sorghum was domesticated in sub-Saharan Africa. Sunflower was in eastern North America, and then oats were domesticated in Western Europe. So cereals are basically domesticated grasses, and people chose to plant seeds from individual wild plants that were selected for certain characteristics. So they chose the seeds that they were going to continue to plant based on the amount of seed that they could get, so the yield per plant, and the ready recovery, so threshing characteristics. How easy was it to harvest? So wheat was domesticated as one of the major cereals, and there were several processes by which wheat was actually domesticated to kind of become what we know of today. So one process was the increase in chromosome number, or ploidity. You've probably heard haploid, diploid, those terms before. So they would kind of cross different species of wheat. For example, you could take a diploid, that's 2 sets of chromosomes, and a haploid, and then you would get one of the 3 sets of chromosomes. So another process was spontaneous hybridization, or crosses between different but closely related species of grasses. And by this, they could actually select for mutations for favorable traits, such as parasite resistance and things like that. The most cultivated wheats were bread or common wheat, durum or macaroni wheat, einkorn, and emmer and spelt. I think that's actually supposed to be einkorn. I think that's supposed to have an N there. So now we're going to talk a little bit about barley. Barley is another cereal grain, and it's fairly popular today still. So it was domesticated about 9,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, so that same area. It was the early domesticated barley had two road spikes, as does the wild progenitor. So this picture, you can see that this is the two road spike variety. And then later, the cultivation of the six road barley began 8,000 years ago. And that spread rapidly because, as you can see, you have a lot more yield with the six row variety. And both of these are used to make bread and beer. So corn is one of the major cereal grains that's used in livestock feed. It's used for ethanol production. Humans eat it. So this is a big one. And that was domesticated 7,000 to 8,000 years ago in Central America. And it was domesticated from teosinte with crosses between teosinte and trypsin, which are kind of two varieties of corn from back in that time period. So this I actually find very, very interesting. So the human genome, actually as a result of the domestication of cereal grains, humans began to eat more starch. So the human genome actually changed as the human diet changed to start including large amounts of these high starch grains or potatoes. So before, saliva didn't have the enzyme amylase, but it then happened over time from them eating this diet. So now saliva contains the enzyme amylase that initiates the digestion of starch. And there are more copies of that gene in populations that consume high amounts of starch-containing foods. So, for example, there would be probably higher amylase production in the saliva of people in the United States or Europe than there would be in like sub-Saharan Africa, for example. So now we're going to talk a little bit about animals that were domesticated. And I should have had Trigger here for this lecture, brought him in now. So the dog was the first domesticated animal. And that domestication resulted from domestication of the gray wolf. So the earliest remains of domesticated dogs actually date from about 15,000 years ago, which is a long time, in Europe and the Middle East. So the first domesticated dogs actually were domesticated to assist with hunting and provide protection for the hunter-gatherer communities. So the domestication of the dog actually kind of came about before the domestication of plants and the need to kind of set up these permanent settlements and start planting and all of that. As far as North America, dogs actually came with humans across the Bering Land Bridge at the end of the last ice age, so about 14,000 BC. So dogs have been around for a long time. So the domestication of the cat came a little bit later, and I like to still say that I'm not completely sure that cats are fully domesticated. Anyone who owns a cat would maybe agree with that. I think we still might have a long way to go for cats to be quite as domesticated as dogs. But they are considered domesticated for all scientific purposes. They were domesticated in the Fertile Crescent by 7,500. So the cats were domesticated after the dogs, kind of around the time when agricultural villages were developing. Cats are the result of domestication of the Near Eastern wildcat, which you can see in this picture right here. So it looks pretty similar to a lot of cats that you see today. So there's not quite as much of a difference, I feel like, in cats today as there is from the dog and the wolf. But cats were really important once agriculture was kind of settled in one place and there were villages because you needed to have stored grain. And with stored grain comes mice and bugs and any other kind of animal that wants to get in there and eat that food. The cats actually reduced the losses of that stored grain from rodents. They were able to protect that, and they became of use for humans, and so that's why they were domesticated. So livestock and poultry. Sheep were domesticated in 9,000 BC in the Fertile Crescent, same region. Goats about 1,000 years later, in the Fertile Crescent as well, cattle in 5800 BC, and then Asian cattle in 2500 BC, and that Asian cattle were actually domesticated on the Indian subcontinent. So sheep, goats, and cattle were domesticated because they could provide meat and milk, and they could convert the indigestible plant materials that were being grown into high-quality protein foods, meat and milk, and for poultry, eggs. So therefore, they were raised by farmers and nomadic people for this reason, because they could really provide good quality products from the plant material that humans couldn't necessarily digest that well. So livestock, a little bit about livestock production today and how it's kind of evolved. So livestock today is raised in the developing world under different systems. So you have pastoral systems where you have pastures. You have nomadic groups on native range in some areas of the developing world that raise cattle. Then you have mixed crop and livestock systems, and that could be either small-scale family or village farms, tenant farmers, sharecroppers, landless peasants, and industrials. So the industrial is kind of a lot of what we have in the United States, especially for pigs and poultry, where you have kind of large-scale confinement systems. So pigs were domesticated independently in present-day China and in the Fertile Crescent around 7000 BC. So kind of at the same time, pigs were being domesticated in both of those regions, kind of independent of each other. And then chickens were domesticated by 5500 BC in what is now northeast China. And pigs and chickens are really good scavengers, and they provide an excellent source of meat. And then as a bonus, chickens also provide eggs. So domestication of horses is also really important. Horses were domesticated around 4000 BC, so a little bit after the dog and the cat. They were domesticated in Central Eurasia, and it was thought that tamed horses were then further domesticated. So the idea was kind of that some horses that were wild had kind of become somewhat tamed and broken a little bit, gotten used to people. And so then those horses were the ones that were then able to be caught and used for further domestication. So much like the plants and dogs and cats, horses were selected for their useful attributes. So they could be used for food, to help with hunting, and of course transportation is a big one. So other mammals were also domesticated. These other mammals included camels, llamas, alpacas, donkeys, reindeer, water buffalo, and guinea pigs. So now we're going to talk about a little about domestication in reverse, so feral animals. So some of you may already have heard that term or know what that means. But feral animals are animals whose ancestors were domesticated. However, now they have reverted and they live in a wild state. So they actually breed in the wild and have relatively wild, stable population. So these feral animals can have a really dramatic effect on the ecosystem because they compete against the native animals that live in that area, and they eat the native plants, and they also prey on other animals. So they can definitely disrupt an ecosystem that maybe they haven't been in a long time because they were domesticated. And
can't some outside animals cause a lot of damage to an ecosystem if they are a predator and they have no natural predator above them in the food chain?
Yes, that's a very good point. Yeah, any animal, especially predators, if they're brought in and there's nothing to control them, and especially if it's an environment they're not native to, they will just destroy, all of their prey and completely disrupt that entire ecosystem. I can't think of it right now, but in one of my classes, we actually talked about an example of that where a species was brought in to control something, and then they ended up having to bring in another species to control that species, and it gets out of hand very quickly. So yeah, that can happen for sure. So some examples of feral animals are the Soay sheep, I think I'm saying that right, on the island of St. Kilda off the Scottish coast, and I'll give a little bit more information about those specifically on the next slide. Dingoes in Australia, feral cats. I'm sure we've all seen, cats that are just outside and pretty feral, no human contact in rural and urban areas. Feral horses, so like the Mustangs and Chincoteague ponies. I was actually in Nevada not too long ago, and I got to see the wild horses of Nevada just walking around through towns, and that was really, really cool. And then feral donkeys, so the burros of the American West, and then wild pigs in the southern United States. I know a lot of them are also in the Georgia area. I've heard of people going on there and try to hunt those, so that's pretty interesting.
Oh, boars are dangerous.
Yeah, they are. I just always remember like the Old Yeller scene, that movie, and they're scary. So a little bit more about Soay sheep. They were on the coast of Scotland until the 1930s. That's where they came from. The largest number now is on the island of Herta, which is one of the St. Kilda group off the Western Isles of Scotland. And they were thought to have been transported to the island either about 4,000 years ago or 1,100 years ago by the Vikings. And they are actually useful biomedical models for internal rhythms in animals. So like the circadian rhythms, like sleep, light cycle rhythms, things like that, that naturally go on in your body. They're really good models for that. All right, and that is all I have for that PowerPoint. Does anybody have questions on Chapter 2?
I do have one question about how are we so certain that all of this, the domestication processes and all that, that how do we know that they went on in the way presented? I mean, is it not possible to think that from the very beginning, farmers were growing plants and animals, and that the hunter-gatherer evidence we see is something that was just going on at the same time in another place? Even today, the plant, I'm trying to think, Mr. Ayers was talking about the show that they have the Alaskan people who are today hunter-gatherers.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering about that, the way it's presented as a definite process from hunter-gatherer to the farmers of today. You know, what makes us think that this wasn't all going on at the same time, just amongst different people?
Right. And I think that's a good point. I think some of it was definitely going on at the same time. So I don't think it was in a sense of, okay, everyone's hunter-gatherers and everyone became farmers. I think there were certain regions where it made sense to start growing crops and things like that. But at the same time, you also had other regions where they were still in the hunter-gatherer stage. Like you said, I mean, there are still some even today that are in that stage. So I don't think that it was kind of an all or nothing. I think you know what you said, some of it was still kind of going on at the same time. As far as how they date everything, that's not really my specialty, so I would be able to give you more information if that was. But I know, they find old remains and things like that, carbon dating, and kind of put together how these things happened. But I don't think it was an all or nothing, like you said. I think a lot of it was going on simultaneously, if that answers your question.
Leanna, I think also what he's talking about with the Alaska deal, that's such a remote area, and it's a very finite, defined ecosystem that they're trying to live in, and it's that's the only point I was bringing out about that their subsistence was very harsh, and they had to really work to try to survive.
Right.
So you're right. I mean, it depends totally on the ecosystem and where we're trying to survive.
Right.
Houston today is going to be a survival situation that we can't quite fathom. So.
Yeah, for sure. Any other questions, comments? All right.
Somebody was talking about the Houston thing about, Houston going to turn feral. I was like agreeing. There's going to be some animals that are going to turn plumb wild, domesticated house cats that are, or that, well, not that a hawk is wild, but there's going to be dogs and cats that they're going to be roaming around, digging around, eating whatever they can find. It's going to be kind of a little bit of jungle out there for a while.
They showed one dog that left its home and went out somewhere and found its bag of food that had been soaked away and brought it back.
Good for him.
I saw that this morning. That was kind of strange. The dog knew where his food was, and he went behind the drink machine and got the bag and was walking down the street with it.
Yeah, yeah, I was like, you go.
You know,
I mean, that was like a big bag too.
Yeah, it was sizable.
Yeah, like no dog. I mean, the person doctors.
He knew he was in for hard times. He was trying to take care of himself.
it was.
Yeah, if that happened, my money's on my cat. My dog is not too bright.
I was like,
Oh my.
All right. Any other questions or anything about that chapter? Then we'll move on. Anything else? All right. We'll move on to chapter 3. That up.
dang. Told us that. 1 minute and 57 seconds.
All right, so now we're going to move on to chapter 3. So chapter 3 is going to talk about a global overview of the livestock industry today. So the objectives of this chapter are to provide an overview on the importance of animal production globally, the importance of cattle to global animal production, the importance of pigs to global animal production, and the importance of poultry to global animal production. So global animal production is very, very important. People depend on animal production and processing for their livelihood, food, high-quality protein, products such as leather and wool. And according to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, or FAO, livestock production accounts for 37% of world agriculture, and that's compared to 63% that's crop production. So animal product consumption, we can talk a little bit about that. The United States has higher meat consumption than most other countries. The United States is extremely developed, so that kind of makes sense. And we're also one of the large producers of meat. So increased consumption of animal products will actually improve pregnancy outcomes and growth in cognition in infants and children. If you remember from last week, we kind of talked about does hunger cause poverty, or does poverty cause hunger? Because when people are hungry, they don't develop as well. When they're malnourished, they can't function as well. They can't focus. So it's pretty obvious that increased consumption of animal products would improve growth and cognition in infants and children because they're getting all of those vitamins and minerals and protein from the animal products. So sometimes there's talk about competition for cereal grains. It's often said that livestock compete with people for cereal grains, especially corn. However, livestock actually consume less than 35% of the grains that are produced globally. And this is because as livestock productions become more efficient, this percentage will continue to decline. So part of animal science is making crop and animal production, or animals, science, more efficient, so that you can actually have animals that are growing better on less feed. And so as that continues to happen, animals will compete less and less for those grains because they won't need as much. Hopefully, that's what we're working towards. So the top animal production countries are the USA, the People's Republic of China, and Brazil. Those are kind of like the big dogs there. And meat production as a percentage of global production is actually declining in Western Europe and Japan due to higher production cost. So production cost will definitely influence how much countries are able to do and actually produce. Just to give you an idea of this kind of numerically, so here we have the world meat production kind of across the years from 1980 until 2004. And you can see that it's been steadily increasing. And then China is actually under the U.S. Under the U.S. to start in 1980, and then it starts kind of taking over from there. And China's become a big meat producer, and so then you have the United States and Brazil also not too far behind. So according to the FAO in 2014, Just to give you an idea, because this table doesn't actually have more recent data. In 2014, there were around 315 million tons that were produced worldwide. So in 10 years, we went from 260 to 315. And so the FAO estimates that by 2050, global meat production will actually increase to 455 million tons. So it's increasing fairly rapidly. So there's been an increase in animal agriculture because mainly there is a preference for animal products. Generally, most people like to eat meat and drink milk and eat eggs and things like that. As the global economy grows, more people actually have the resources to buy food, particularly animal products. So as countries become more developed and people kind of get more money and the economy grows, they can afford to buy items like meat and animal products. So that's a big driving force for this increase in animal agriculture, as well as we talked about in the last class, population increase is huge. So that is a major driving force for increase in animal agriculture. So there are nutritional reasons why people need and prefer animal products. Animal products such as meat provide high quality protein, meat and eggs, high quality protein, iron, zinc, calcium, and vitamins such as niacin or vitamin B12. And all of these are very important to well-functioning metabolism. So animal products are really important and very beneficial, actually. So why eat animal products? I kind of just hit on it a little bit on the last slide. But an average in the U.S. in the diet, animal products provide 35% of the energy, 68% of protein, 78% of calcium, 39% of iron, 42% of vitamin A, and 37 to 98% of vitamins, depending on which product you're eating. So the proportion of protein and other nutrients coming from animal products is actually much lower in developing countries, because in developing countries that may not have quite the economy that we do here, they might be relying more on plant products and things like that than they actually are on animal products. But that is increasing as countries develop. So to jump into beef and dairy production, there have been major increases in the global production of meat from cattle and also milk production. There have been increases in all production systems, so extensive production systems with grains or grass-fed cattle and pastoral systems in developing countries, and then intensive systems and mixed crop systems. So you may be familiar with, but if you're not, for those of you that are not, so intensive systems can actually use less land and be more productive because they use things like pesticides and machinery and irrigation and things like that. But plants, they can be more intensive and more things focused on a smaller area of land and produce more than extensive, which requires a larger area of land to kind of produce the same amount. So that's just the difference there. But some countries don't have really a chance to be intensive because they don't have the resources and the machinery, so they're actually more extensive. So beef and dairy production kind of continued, a little bit more about that. Beef, pork, and poultry meat actually each represent almost 1/3 of the meat that's produced and consumed globally. And beef production is growing, with global production up 11% between 1990 and 2005. And there's been an 89% increase in beef production in China. So beef production in China has really taken off. So the top players in world beef production are the United States, Brazil, China, Argentina, and India. So now we're going to talk about milk production, and the U.S. was actually the leading milk production nation mainly all throughout the 20th century. However, in 1997, India actually took over that first place spot, and we'll talk a little bit about that in detail in a second. So the USA is still the #1 producer of milk from cattle. So you can kind of make that distinction there. They're not the overall #1 producer of milk, but they're still #1 for milk from cattle. So milk production is increasing in China and Pakistan as well as Brazil in the last 10 years. So the top players in milk production are India, the United States, the Russian Federation, Pakistan, and China. So how did India kind of become number one in milk production? So now, like I said, they're the world's leading milk producing nation. And from 1970 to 2005, their production of milk from water buffalo, as well as cattle, has increased by 4 to 6-fold. So that has actually been huge, and that's what kind of led them to take over that number one spot from the U.S. Is that they not only produce milk from cattle, but also from water buffalo because they have a lot of those there. So this growth is also due in part to successes of a series of cooperatives that market the milk in India, and increase in milk production and availability has enabled per person consumption to double to over a cup per day. So pork production has also seen global increases. There have been increases in all production systems, much like in beef. There are pastoral systems of developing countries where the animals are kept outside. Then there are mixed crop systems, and then what we're more familiar with in the U.S. are the intensive industrial models of cereals or other high energy components. So in more kind of developed countries, we're actually able to kind of keep them inside and have more intensive systems. Whereas in the developing countries, again, they kind of keep them out and have to utilize the land because they may not have access to the cereal grains and things like that that we have a lot of here. So traditionally, pigs were scavengers in villages and farmsteads before they were domesticated. So the current trend in pork production is towards large, high-efficient pig-producing operations. So there's actually been kind of a decrease in the number of smaller family farms with pork production and more of an increase in larger size farms. So the number of farms has gone down, but the number of pigs per farm has actually increased. And so now you're seeing integration with breeders and or meat processors called the industrialized model. And integration basically means that a company will own most of that process from the feed mills to the animals to the processing. So integration is, a company owns several pieces of that process. And actually in poultry, poultry is what we call vertically integrated. And so most poultry companies actually own every component of the poultry production process. So that's kind of what that word means. So there have been large increases in pig production in China as well as Southeast Asia, and increases in the United States and in Brazil. Also, sorry if y'all can hear that printer behind me kind of going crazy. So the top players in pig production are China, which is a very, very large producer of pork, the United States, and actually a lot of the pork that we produce in the United States is exported to China. So China is consuming a lot of pork. And then Germany is number 3, Brazil, and then you have Spain. And Brazil and Spain kind of flip-flop for the 4 and 5 spot on pork production. So there's been kind of static pork production in Europe. That's kind of due in part to more regulations and production costs and things that are that they have to deal with over there that some of it we have to deal with over here, but over here it's not as static as it is in Europe at all. It's still increasing. So in developing countries, pig and poultry production is often in densely populated areas near cities because they want to be able to be as close to the market as they can to lower the transportation cost. So it makes sense in that aspect. However, when you have pork production close to densely populated areas, you have adverse effects that include pollutants and pathogens that are in those populated areas, and that can actually disrupt the fragile ecosystems that are there. And then also, you have, with the pork production, you've got to have the lagoons and things like that because the animals are putting off, gases and excreting nitrogen into the environment, which are all things that are pretty tightly regulated and controlled, but things to think about when you have them that close to densely populated areas. The poultry and egg production have also increased. The largest increases have been seen in chicken production in China, increased by up to 67%. Brazil, it's actually increased by 112%, so quite a large increase there. And then in Vietnam, 136%, and India, 217% increase. So that's very, very rapid. And in the United States, the increase in chicken production was 38% from 1995 to 2005. And this growth was mainly due to consumer preference for these products and lower prices resulting from production efficiency. And poultry is actually consumed a lot, and kind of one of the factors that leads to it as well is that with pork and beef, you kind of have some specialty products, but with chicken, you have chicken nuggets, chicken tenders. You have all of these different products that you can get from poultry that are marketed in different ways. So there's been a lot of increases in chicken production. The top players in poultry production are the United States, China, Brazil, so kind of those three main ones that you kind of see everywhere, and then Mexico and India. So egg production is also growing rapidly. It's increased 39% over the last 10 years. And Asian countries have really high rates of egg production. So China has increased 42% and India 67%. And egg production in the European Union has increased by only 6% from 1995 to 2005. So not quite as rapid as the other countries. And that's all I have for chapter 2. So does anybody have any questions on any of that?
The increase on the production of the animals, do they use steroids to help with the increase with the animals?
So the increases in production are more due to not really necessarily steroids, but more to nutritional practices that can make them more efficient, and well, really nutritional and management practices. So you can enzyme, for example, is kind of a big thing. So like especially in pigs, they're not as efficient at digesting feed as ruminants are. So if you feed them enzymes that they don't naturally produce, they can better break down the feed components and then get more nutritional value from the feed, and you can actually get more growth from that pig on the same amount or less feed. So it's kind of more of that, and then how animals are managed more so than steroids. I know in years past they've used some growth hormones and things like that, but now with all of the regulations and consumer demand and things, those are really being phased out. So it's really other things to really improve the efficiency of the production systems, like with pigs, like weaning age and things like that. There are all of these different factors that are looked at in each production system to make that animal healthier and more efficient, so that they can become larger and we need less animals and less feed. Does that answer?
Chickens and poultry have had tremendous increases through genetic breeding and so forth.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, so all components from the genetics and breeding to the nutrition and the management and reproductive physiology, these are all areas that research is definitely ongoing in. And yeah, with birds, it's been a lot due to genetics. Thank you for pointing that out. Any other questions?
If the countries have gotten more increase in population, the animals has increased. Is the more people raising them, or is it just they haven't been doing it because of the population?
Sorry, what was the last part of the question?
I said where the population has grown a lot and the animals have been growing animals has increased. Is the people that's there that's the population increasing, is that causing the animals to raise the animals, or is another subsidiary that raising them?
So I would say the number of people raising the animals is kind of gone down. You just have more animals being raised. Like if you have a farm with, let's say one farmer is running a farm, that farmer will be taking care of more animals, as opposed to more people kind of having more farms. Is that what you were asking.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's really kind of moving away from the smaller scale farms where there are a lot of small farms with small numbers of animals to fewer farms with a lot more animals that are kind of moving towards bigger production systems.
Becoming more efficient.
Yes. Anything else?
I was wondering, you had the numbers listed for the percentage increases of various animal products. Is that because, does that reflect how much more popular meat is becoming with plants, or is that, how much of that reflects population growth? I mean, obviously, the more people we have, the more we have to produce.
Right. I would say some of it represents population growth, but also in addition to population development growth. So development, population, yeah, you have more people that are going to be needing to be fed, but with development, you also have people that are eating more meat. So it's kind of both. You have that increase in population where there's more people, but then the people that you already have are actually eating more meat as their countries kind of develop and they get the economy and the money to buy the meat. So it's a lot kind of in that increase.
Is it how much meat is actually being consumed or how much meat is actually being purchased? Because if you think about the food waste, like in the United States, a lot more I think is being purchased than is actually being eaten.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. So I would say the numbers in this slideshow are what's being produced. So what I have here doesn't really account for the waste. Because like you said, I've bought chicken at the store that's gone bad and I've thrown it out. That's not being consumed. So it's kind of hard to keep track of how much is being wasted. I know, if it's in the store and then it has to be thrown out because it's past the date or it's not used, that's fairly easy to keep track of because, you can collect that data, how much was at the store, how much was sold. But as far as in people's houses, you don't really know what they threw out and what they ate. So it's kind of hard to keep track of that number. So mostly what they just talk about is how much is being produced and then consumed, but that number is probably based off how much is bought. So that's a very good point.
Bought's assumed to be consumed.
Right. Yeah. I mean, really, there's no way to really know how much people are, sitting down at their table and eating versus giving to their dog or something. Anything else? Any questions about anything on Blackboard? You should be able to see these slides for this week. But if you have any trouble with anything in Blackboard or something's not showing up, let me know, and I can go in there. Any other questions?
Hopefully we've gotten the Blackboard situations solved.
Yes. Yes. Very helpful now. I can kind of see where everybody's at and everything. So yeah, thanks for helping with all of that. All right. Well, it looks like no one has any other questions, so I guess I'll let y'all go and I'll see you on Thursday.
See you Thursday.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks, Lynn.
Okay, bye. Drive safe.
Always wait.
Start chapter 3.